Security is critical in life sciences manufacturing and pharmaceutical production. You want and need to protect your intellectual property, assets, and clinical data. How do you mitigate risk while advancing science and ensuring production? We're going to answer that question today in episode 1 of Secure Innovation: How Life Sciences and Pharmaceutical Companies Can Safely Seize Opportunity, a 3-episode podcast series intended to help you securely grow your business. I'm your host, Jennifer L.W. Fink, and joining me today is Fani Chagante, Managing Director and Head of Cyber Resilience at NTT Data. Fani has master's degrees in both electrical engineering and business administration, and more than 20 years experience in wireless networks and cybersecurity across a variety of industries. Welcome, Fani.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure being here.
First, let's discuss the unique security challenges of life sciences and pharmaceutical companies. What are some of the major challenges to cybersecurity in life sciences manufacturing?
Sure, Jennifer. The first thing to realize is the life sciences industry is a highly regulated industry. So any kind of security breach there poses a significant risk. Companies have a lot of important physical and technical areas they need to protect, from where they manufacture stuff in their manufacturing plants to research, laboratory equipment, any critical clinical data or otherwise that they collect, any products they manufacture, specifications, all of these, and then most importantly, trade secrets and scientific know-how, intellectual know-how, all of these need to be protected. But the challenge lies therein because now you have a lot of external disruptions, right? You have the pandemic that was of the recent past. You have a lot of geopolitical instability that can cause a lot of challenges to these kind of environments, which then disrupts your supply chain uncertainty. So if you see from end to end, it's a sequence of events, and at any point, any touch point can go wrong when you try to protect this kind of vast critical information. So that is a big challenge for these folks. Like, where do I start? What do I need to protect? How can it happen?
So there's essential data, information, physical equipment. There's multiple points of potential disruption. It's a little overwhelming. How can life sciences leaders assess the security of their operations? You have to start there, right?
Absolutely, right. The first question, top of the mind, like you rightly pointed out, is where do I start? Usually, especially when you go into a traditional manufacturing environment, there is a huge misalignment between people producing goods on a manufacturing plant versus their typical IT stack, because philosophically, they have different perspectives. The IT staff are all about confidentiality and protecting this information at all costs and running patches and so on and so forth. But folks on the production floor never want production to be disrupted, and so they never have time for running a patch and putting controls in place. So the education of getting these different folks, different facets of your organization or ecosystem aligned is the first step to start, right? Influence a massive cultural change, right? And this is what leaders need to be asking of their ecosystem is, how and where do we start securing the network? That's a great start to even ask that question.
So there is a difference in priorities. Everybody wants to, essentially, bottom line, bring helpful products to those who need them. But your IT staff is all about, let's keep this safe and secure, and manufacturing wants to keep products moving, keep the products in process.
Absolutely. And each one of them is right in their own way. So finding that right balance and getting both of the teams to come and talk in the same room is a cultural change that organizations and ecosystems have to embrace.
You have previously written a 6-step guide to strong cybersecurity in life sciences manufacturing. I think going through those steps would be helpful for people to understand how to make that happen. It's easy to say you need to bring these people together and create cultural change, but how do you do that? Let's go through these 6 steps first. Just outline the 6 steps and then we'll dig into them.
Yeah, absolutely. Any successful security program or initiative starts with having a clear, objective, governance and steering team to play that role of a champion, right? Once you have that, the automatic second step would be to try to get a visibility and conduct an audit of all your assets and their network and their connectivity, right? Get their visibility, because ultimately, if you cannot see it, you cannot protect it. I think everybody realizes that. And as you get that visibility and asset inventory, you want to identify the vulnerabilities that have been released by the different vendors in the dark web and so on, and use that to start creating a framework and a customized set of rules, right, to enforce upon, right? And then importantly, as you do this, your ecosystem is going to undergo a change. So an important fourth step would be to ensure that your teams are talking to each other and they undergo relevant training, right? Not just any training, but relevant training to make sure their whole ecosystem is in compliance. There are certain benchmarks that they follow, right? Pick a benchmark and make sure you follow that. There are many out there. And then obviously there are some things that absolutely need fixing yesterday, right? So create those ground rules for hardening your ecosystem, patching, right? And at some point, I cannot patch this, I need to increase productivity, is not going to be a good answer, because the collateral damage of if something were to happen is far more severe. And so you have no choice but to go ahead and get those patches in place, right? And then ultimately, I think fundamental rule is to implement a philosophy of zero trust, right? A zero trust policy, essentially, which says trust no one, believe no one, right? Implicitly assume that anybody and everybody is a threat to your ecosystem. So work on those foundational principles.
Let's work our way through these 6 steps. And examples, as you know, are always helpful for people. Start at the beginning. Establish governance and steering. Most of our listeners have already done this, but how do they know if they've done a good job? What tends to be overlooked at this stage?
So the first most fundamental aspect of any security program should be your business drivers, right? And so as a consequence of that, you want to engage a steering committee, a governance committee that is meaningful, not just somebody who's very high up your corporate chain, right? Use them so that they can explicitly help you in a strategic engagement, operational levels, and engage different kinds of stakeholders in all the business aspects of your ecosystem. This will go a long way in achieving a very trusted, a more predictable and reliable partnership among all peer organizations and outside, right? So this then goes back to solving your first problem, is in bridging that gap between, let's say, IT and OT and other groups, right? So this helped bring that alignment, number one. Number two, you've seen problems and challenges, but use the governance and steering committee to actually enforce policies. We've seen a lot of organizations that have great policies written, but enforcing that policies, enforcing those ground rules is a completely different ball game. So this governance and steering committee can help drive towards that, help establish changes, change orders, and so on and so forth.
So a useful, effective governance and steering committee is going to have people from OT, from IT, people of various levels, stakeholders. Are there certain job titles that you want to make sure are included, or will this look different for each company?
Absolutely. I mean, job titles, yes, you can think about your, for example, a plant floor engineer, a process floor engineer, your IT and security engineers and architects, all of them can be. So I don't think defining explicitly with job titles is going to be the best way. But like you said, right, customize it with each ecosystem, because there are different organizations that have different hierarchy of titles. And so we don't want to dilute anything by explicitly calling out job titles. There might not be a job title, but the job functions are more critical than the titles itself. But yes, it varies for each organization.
What might be a red flag that the governance committee, as it is currently constituted, may need some shaking up or might need some other voices to it?
One of the red flags is usually the governance and steering committee should not or typically does not get engaged in the day-to-day activities of a security engineer's role, do not define the policies, do not define the rule sets, right? Their job is strictly governance, making sure that business objectives and security objectives are met. So if that is not happening, right, if there is no visibility or a KPI to define the effectiveness of your security program, then the governance and steering committee are probably not asking the right questions of their team and making sure they're on track with the right controls.
That's an excellent point, because you can have a governance and steering committee, and if it's not effective, that's the equivalent of not having a committee.
Absolutely.
Second step, conduct an audit of all your assets and network visibility. This is a big job for a company.
Indeed. So it's very simple, right? You cannot protect what you cannot see. If you have to break it down further, right? If you go to a supplier or hardware store to buy locks for your house, unless you know how many doors, windows, etc., you don't know how many locks or doors or assets to purchase to protect those, right? On that same token, it's very important to have complete visibility, not only for regulatory reasons, but for simple security posture reasons, how many assets you have. And when we say assets, it's not just a simple case of a list of asset inventory. It's also the different pieces of communication that goes on between these assets and the outside world, or the outside world trying to reach into them. Furthermore, you also align these assets with the probability of risks through all the different kinds of vulnerabilities, and then you use them to prioritize those risks. So that way you know what you need to protect, you see what you need to protect, and you're able to bring in, through the help of your governance and steering committee, certain controls and so on and so forth, so that you have a better view of what you're trying to protect. Very, very critical.
It's easier to protect the obvious assets. It's more difficult to uncover hidden assets or overlooked assets. So what approach should companies take to try and make sure that they've discovered everything?
Great question, right? Because with the tongue-in-cheek as an engineer, I'll tell you that I can be generic, but most engineers are not the best documenters of work, right? A lot of organizations, I can vouch, do not keep a most current and up-to-date asset inventory. So obviously there are going to be assets that are connected to the network, and then there are going to be assets, like you said, that are hidden. It's simple. If you have an asset that is connected to a network, there are many a tool outside that can be used to detect this. But what about that computer that you have in the coffee room or the copy room behind the Xerox machine or something that you've never used? Come an emergency, you pop it open, and suddenly it's the most vulnerable device. So that is something, the approach is really to do a risk-based interview assessment, talk to the folks, and get as close as possible as you can to your most current assets. And if they are not part of your asset inventory, have certain controls that make sure that these assets are not authenticated or authorized after a certain time to actually get into your network or to be able to connect to anything. So at least that way, it is contained within the asset, right? So it goes without saying, right? Fundamental discipline, I think, is the key at that point, because this happens. Why are we having hidden assets? This happens because people forget to retire a device. Let's say an employee moves on from the organization. His computer, his account, his credentials, they all have to be retired. It again goes back to classic. This is not specific to life sciences. This is general IT hygiene as well. To decommission, to retire an asset, to retire the user, and so on and so forth. So a good record keeping goes a long way in doing that. I say that with a tongue in cheek.
Yeah, so it's conducting the asset, recording what you discover, and at some point you need to make a system and a schedule to look at this on a regular basis. This is the kind of thing that's very easy to fall out of date on, and that would create security risks.
100%, because continual monitoring of assets is the only way. It's the only way. Otherwise, you're taking a chance, and when you take a chance, it's a question of, not a question of if, it's a question of when.
You mentioned in that step, you're also looking at basically the risk level presented by each asset. As we move into step 3, which is create a customized set of rules, I would imagine that higher risk assets will have a different set of rules than the lower risk ones.
100%, right? Great point as a precursor to what we talk, right? Obviously, when you're in the life sciences environment or in any manufacturing environment in general, it's an ecosystem of heterogeneous devices, like you just say. So there are some devices that are probably at lower risk and some devices at higher risk. It should not be confused with the cost of a devices. There are some devices that might only cost 50 cents, but they're connected to $1 million ecosystem. So the collateral damage also needs to be taken into account. So saying that, an important step again goes back to the documentation, and a step often missed by many an organization is the ability to classify an asset. If you don't classify the value of an asset in terms of the potential damage and then the value to its own business needs, it's very hard to create those customized set of rules for each of those assets. Because in that case of not classifying, you might just create rules, lay overemphasis on a device or an asset whose risk is very minimal, right? So that goes down to risk appetite. When you classify assets, you're able to then tie that with your risk appetite and then now make a more holistic decision on how you want to package those rules, what kind of controls and governance. You don't want to put a $200 lock on a bond that costs only $100. But at the same time, you don't want to put a $10 lock on your house that probably costs $500,000, right? So creating that customized set of rules based on the risk appetite, the associated vulnerabilities, all of those go into making a good security posture and ecosystem with the governance.
I want to emphasize that point, that the value of an asset is not necessarily its straight up financial value. The value is in what is behind that. What is that giving access to, right?
Absolutely. That's why when we talk about asset visibility, we also talk about the network visibility and all the other communications associated with that asset, right? For a simple example, if you just have a simple computer, it costs $2,000, but when connected to your ecosystem or a corporate network, now the value is immeasurable, right? And so risk quantification, asset classification, risk appetite, all of these play a major role in determining how you want to tailor-make your policies and procedures, right? So you can match the specific environments.
As you are looking at your specific assets and working to create these customized rules, you also have to deal with this slight, sometimes conflict in priorities between IT security and OT's need to keep manufacturing going. How do you reconcile those conflicting priorities to create realistic, functional, customized rules?
It goes back to step 1 all the time. All these steps need a lot of stakeholder support from your governance and steering committee. Matching specific environments and tailoring all these policies and procedures is very crucial for an efficient security strategy. And now to actually get people on board, you want to promote the culture of security, the awareness, and provide training at various skill levels, right? You cannot have a single generic training curriculum for all the faculty involved in that ecosystem, right? You want different levels according to the different skill sets, different job responsibilities, and some of them might be warranted to actually go really deep and get a professional certification so that they can do a deep dive into the different standards and benchmarks applicable to them and customize all of these, right? For example, a great resource about benchmarks and frameworks comes from the NIST special publications, right? For the OT side specifically, if I might call out, it's NIST 800-82, a guide to operational technology security. This frameworks, adherence to frameworks, training, cultural shift in the mindset, governance and steering inputs can help create a more efficient and a resilient workforce, right? While improving your security posture and efficiency itself.
So we're touching a little bit on step 4 here, conducting training. And you have repeatedly emphasized this is not one size fits all. And security training is relevant to everybody. in an organization?
Absolutely. There is always a question, right? Especially if you're a certified security engineer, who is ultimately responsible for security? I'd like to rephrase that question as, whose responsibility is security? And the answer is everybody. Everybody is responsible and has a stake in security. Because think about it, when you deal with critical infrastructure, critical machinery, and if they are not secure, lives are at stake. And there is nothing, no business value that precedes a human life, right? And security goes a long way in protecting human life. So I think I can state that security is everybody's responsibility. It ultimately has maybe the CIO or the CS security officer who signs off on it, but nobody can hide from the fact that everybody has a role to play in this ball game.
This goes to that culture change that you were talking about as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why people need to realize, people need to be coached and trained that they are equally responsible and they need to learn and be sure, right? It's just like in the airport, if you see something, say it. So that's why that cultural shift in mindset, because it's the new war with this digital transformation. Everybody wants everything connected. There are no more boundaries in an operation of an ecosystem. It just makes it that much more challenging, right? And with sophistication and technology on the side of the ecosystem, it is growing equally on the bad guys side, if I may, right? They have access to the same technology. So culturally, people, process, technology, all of these need to come together when you to defend against a very formidable opponent.
People, process, and technology all have to come together to maintain security. Because I know people, generally the people side is the more difficult part of that. Technology you can control. People are a little more difficult.
Yes, 100%, right? And that's where, again, the governance and steering committee as a champion of security plays a huge role. Money can buy technology, but people and process, that cultural shift in mindset, you can just buy with money. You need the coaching, you need the training, you need to embrace certain standards. And sometimes, yes, change is hard. People don't like the way it's done, but that's the most secure way. I don't like to carry a key with me when I lock my house, but that's the safest way.
And it takes time to get to that with people. It's not as simple as imposing a policy and expecting that it will be followed.
Absolutely, right. It cannot be built in a day. It is a journey. And the same thing goes to technology. It is not you deploy a certain technology and assume you are safe for the rest of your journey, because the threat landscape is ever evolving with all the change in technology. Thereby, your security posture needs to be flexible and nimble. It's not a one-stop shop. I've put in controls, I'm good to go. Because there is a new threat lurking every day. You need to tweak and adapt to managing against those. And those are popularly also known as your zero-day threats, right? Because nobody even knows they existed, and then suddenly, bam, you're out.
Yeah. This leads us right into step 5, secure access by hardening and patching. You can't just set up your tech and assume that all is fine, because threats are continually evolving.
Let's break that step down, right? Securing access. So that really means that you want to implement a very, very robust mechanism to let people access certain tools and so on and so forth. But remember, when you do this as an organization, because business needs come first, you want to make it as seamless as possible. You don't want to set up access controls and things of that nature that restricts access, that makes the life of people doing their jobs very, very hard. So it's a fine balance that you have to find.
Because when you do that, that is when people try workarounds, which end up increasing the threat to companies.
Exactly right. Right? So you want to collect some metadata. You want to see who needs what access and how much access to certain data sets and so forth, right? And that only comes from those data custodians and those data owners, right? So you want to create that first layer of access control in a very robust fashion, right? And the second step to that is, when you create that access control, you also want to incorporate certain hardening and patching systems, right? Even if somebody were to access your ecosystem, if you haven't patched your system, that means you've left them vulnerable. So this goes into almost like a defense in depth kind of mechanism. If somebody breaks access, but hey, the fact that you patched your systems now lets them be less vulnerable than they were before you patched them, right? And so it's very important to create this secure access by proper hardening and patching of the ecosystem.
As you are hardening and patching, this is the point where you said earlier, you may need to temporarily shut down production. It is this critical and this important.
Absolutely. And for that reason, most organizations have defined what they call maintenance windows, right? I don't think any business is willing to take a risk if they know they're highly vulnerable, and that vulnerability can either cause complete business disruption or in fact to the extent of impacting people's lives, right? And so at some point you have to take advantage of the maintenance window and do that, obviously. And if you cannot do that for some reason, let's say you're running really critical heavy machinery that takes 2 days to shut down and 2 days to come back with severe temperature, so then you got to create certain additional compensating controls, right? That you segment that piece of asset away from anybody else. So even if it gets breached, the vulnerability does not permeate across the entire ecosystem. So you want to move that behind a certain firewall, create additional compensating controls if patching is never an option, right? But considering the life sciences ecosystem, I doubt that there is such a machine where you move something to 5,000 Kelvin and back down over a day. But if that is the case, there are controls to do that as well.
Okay. So this is one that may look very different for each company. Absolutely 100% critical. Final step, step 6, implement a zero trust policy. So we've done all of this work. We've involved all these people, and we essentially say, trust no one.
Very, very important. Let me start with a very simple example. My house got broken into once. I locked my house. Everything was perfect. Had an alarm system going. I thought the thing I did was I locked my house, left the key under the doormat. After some time, somebody obviously noted that, took the key from under the doormat and walked into my house. It was not broken into, it was open. And there were certain things that were taken, right? So the moral of the story there I learned is somebody is always watching, somebody is always trying to break in, right? Just because they look like your friendly neighborhood guy doesn't mean that they are trustworthy, right? Not with an ecosystem, I won't trust them with a few $1 million at stake, right? Or $1 billion. So zero trust philosophy, at least, right, assumes there is no implicit trust at any point granted to any user assets. It's very easy to break that. People make a phone call, let's say there is a help desk, and superiority in position sometimes creates that undue pressure. And if people don't authenticate them properly, it could be anyone who can pick up the phone and make those kinds of claims, right? So it's very important to adopt and embrace that form of operation and be practical about it, right? Zero trust. I'm not suggesting by any means that everybody needs to go to zero trust, but it's a way of functioning to have a more resilient security posture, right? Always, never trust anyone, always verify is some of the fundamentals of that, right? And then always validate every action in your ecosystem, all the data flows, right? Validate each of those communications in both directions. If something is an anomaly, it probably is. Investigate it and then put it off as an exception if it was something that you expected. And most importantly is grant the least amount of privileges. I should only have access to information that I absolutely need and no more. And when I don't have need to that information, I should have lost privileges to that. It goes back to the foundation that we talked about: retire, decommissioning accounts, least privileges, and so on and so forth. They're fundamental IT principles. There is a lot we can learn from the IT world that can be applied to the OT world and IoT world as well.
I'm picturing these 6 steps kind of as a circle that you're continually going around, because this is not just a linear process where you progress from step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you're done. You're never done with this.
It's security, just like we talked about earlier, right? The threat landscape is ever evolving. the technology for the bad guys is evolving at the same pace as the technology for the good guys and the good world, right? And so if the bad guys are evolving, we do not have a choice. It is not, I wish I could do this. It is a necessity right now. Culturally, philosophically, I urge all leaders to start thinking a security first concept, right? Security should never be an afterthought. Security is never stagnant, and security is not bought off the shelves.
Security should not be an afterthought. Security needs to be forefront, because without security, you cannot fulfill your mission of getting your innovations to those who need them without potentially causing harm and incurring some great expense in the process.
Yes, and not to forget, at a lot of organizations, human life could be at stake as well. Safety is an important aspect of security.
Maintaining that respect for human life, preserving that, sharing that within the culture really will help people keep security forefront in everything they do. It's so easy to get focused on the minutia of our individual jobs, but the big picture is we have to protect these lives. In this episode, we have outlined 6 steps to strong cybersecurity. Step 1, establish governance and steering. Step 2, conduct an audit of assets and network visibility. Step 3, create a customized set of rules. 4, conduct training at all levels. 5, secure access by hardening and patching. And finally, step 6, implement a zero trust policy. Fani, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with me, with our listeners. We know that each business has unique challenges, and we've covered a lot of material in a very short time here. So if our listeners have any questions, I encourage you to reach out. Fani, how can listeners reach you if they'd like to learn more?
Thank you, Jennifer. It's been an absolute pleasure, and be very, very glad to help any organization build a strong foundation to build a more resilient future for them. I can be reached out with any comments, questions at fani.chaganti@nttdata.com.
Listeners, you are also invited to go to nttdata.com. We will have a link in the show notes to make it a little easier to reach out. And once again, Fani, I want to thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. And thank you to all who joined us for this conversation, this inaugural episode of Secure Innovation, how life sciences and pharmaceutical companies can safely seize opportunity. In episode 2, we're going to delve into quality assurance and explore some of the opportunities presented by the latest QA guidance. I encourage you to join us for that one as well. But until then, goodbye.